climate change issues, and it's now a matter of hours before American President Donald Trump gives direction on whether the U.S. will be pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Accord. While leaders, climate policy experts, scientists and environmental advocates have raised concerns about the possible drawback in the fight against global warming.
White House officials had by Wednesday indicated that President Donald Trump was going to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And it is this that has set off a worldwide reaction.
So he could withdraw in one of really three ways. The first and the easiest is he could just stop engaging with the other countries on the Paris Agreement and stop living up to the agreements that the Obama administration said that it was going to comply with when it agreed to the Paris Agreement. Secondly, it could formally withdraw from the Paris Agreement. That is actually a very lengthy process. It takes 4 years to do that. It wouldn't be difficult to do, it's just time-consuming and lengthy. And the third is actually the most dramatic and one that there are rumors the Trump administration is considering. And that is to renege on not just the Paris Agreement, but this overarching agreement called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that we've been a party to for 25 years and that was actually originally signed by George H.W. Bush in 1992.
The Paris Accord was the first legally binding global deal to fight climate change. Virtually every nation voluntarily committed to steps aimed at curbing global emissions of greenhouse gases. The United States committed to reduce its emission by 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2025.
And if we don't do that, if we continue to emit carbon emissions at the rate that we have been, if we take that business as usual approach, the climate at the end of the 21st century is going to look pretty unrecognizable relative to the 20th century climate, and that's not going to be a good thing for a lot of people and living things on Earth.
Trump has also said that the accord would cost the U.S. economy trillions of dollars without tangible benefits. Trump refused to endorse the accord at a recent summit of the G7 group of wealthy nations in Italy, saying he needed more time to decide. The Sierra Club said a U.S. withdrawal from the Paris deal would be a historic mistake. Trump vowed during his 2016 presidential campaign to cancel the Paris deal within 100 days of becoming president, part of an effort to bolster U.S. oil and coal industries. Susan Mongeli, CGTN.
For more on this, we're joined by CGTN's Nathan King in Washington. Nathan, it's now hours to that crucial announcement by the American president. Do we have strong indications that Trump is going to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Change Accord?
That seems to be where Washington thinks he is heading. There has been a big debate, as the president said himself in the last 24 hours. He's heard lots of arguments for it, lots of arguments against. But let's look at where we've been over the last week or so. Remember, he was in Europe for the G7 meetings in Italy. Those talks did not go well when it came to climate change. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, Emmanuel Macron both expressed disappointment with the fact that they couldn't come to an agreement in the communique on climate change. Macron thought he might stay in, Angela Merkel indicating might pull out. Also, we've had this sort of battle behind us here at the White House, if you like, between the sort of economic nationalists, America first sort of people, and then people who want to stay in, like his daughter, Ivanka Trump, an advisor to the president, who wants to stay in. Also, her husband, Jared Kushner, as senior advisor as well. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, wants to stay in, even though he's former head of the big oil giant Exxon Mobil. So there's lots of arguments for, lots of arguments against, but it's really the president who decides. And because of the way the Paris Agreement was set up, where it's not ratified by the US Congress, basically he can pull out whenever he wants, even though it may take a couple of years to come out. He's basically stopped complying anyway by rolling back certain regulations. So we'll have to wait and see, but the smart money and a lot of whispers and a lot of anonymous sources are saying that's where he goes. But remember, this is Donald Trump. He can change his mind, as we've seen before.
So if the U.S. does indeed pull out of the Climate Pact deal, what is the likely impact of the country's engagement with the international community?
Well, I mean, in the climate sense, obviously it's a big deal because you have the second biggest emitter, as we've been talking about. The targets were ambitious, 26 to 28% reduction in emissions from 2005 levels by 2025. And remember, these were agreed to with China as well before the Paris Accords, where China would cap emissions by 2030, developing and developed world coming together for the first time really on climate change. If he decides to pull out, there is a big leadership hole. We've been talking the last 24 hours. He would join a very small club of Syria and Nicaragua, who aren't a party to this agreement. But it would also be a wider impact as well, because countries that are lukewarm about it, for example, Russia has signed but not ratified the Paris Agreement, may not want to implement it if the US, the world's biggest economy, is it. And there are others too, as we know in the developing world. India took a lot of arm twisting, some South American countries, and some smaller developing countries, especially in Africa, that feel that they should be able to pollute just like the westernized powers did over the last few hundred years. So that is if you don't show leadership, that is the problem. Now, on the wider note, remember, Donald Trump is a deal maker. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. What we've seen since he's come into office is actually backing out of deals. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big regional Asian free trade deal, leaving 11 partners, 12 partners hanging, and now potentially the Paris Climate Agreement as well. So this is a gap of leadership, not to mention, of course, what he said to NATO members about paying their own way, but also not at the same time totally backing Article 5. For example, the mutual defense clause in the NATO alliance. So there is a feeling that American leadership is being dialed back. America first, a lot of his advisors says, doesn't mean only America, but some are feeling there is a shift.
All right, Nathan King for us live in Washington. Thank you, Nathan.